Hide that uniform. It's an absolute disgrace. My mom hissed, shoving the silk dress hard against my chest. The Sterling family is the elite. Do not wear those bullet-ridden rags to humiliate me at your brother's wedding. I froze. My hands, the same hands that had held steady under the worst pressure this world could throw, at a person now trembled before the sheer cruelty of my own flesh and blood. She despised my uniform. She was perfectly willing to erase my very soul just to suck up to high society. Out in the hallway, my father heard every single word of her abuse, yet he hastily turned his back and fled. My mother thought she had won by hiding me away at table number 9, but she had absolutely no idea that the moment I pushed open the grand hall doors and stepped inside, 12 of the most powerful men in the billionaire class would simultaneously shoot to their feet, performing an action that would freeze her arrogant smile forever. Before I tell you what happened, please take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel, but only if this story resonates with you. And let me know in the comments where you are watching from, and what time it is where you are. The rustle of that cold silk against my chest faded into a different sound. The sharp shook of a paring knife dragging through apple skin. That sound had been the soundtrack of my obedience for a decade. I sat in the corner of our freezing living room, silently peeling apples, arranging them on a gold-rimmed plate, with the precision of someone trained to disassemble a rifle blindfolded. The cloying smell of the cheap synthetic silk still clung to my nostrils, mixing with the sickeningly sweet chamomile tea, steaming from the porcelain cups on the coffee table. My posture was deliberately collapsed. Every military instinct suppressed, every reflex smothered. I had made myself into the mute servant they demanded. Across the room, my mother paced like a dictator, inspecting her territory, aggressively polishing silverware that was already spotless. She never looked at me. She did not need to. Her heavy doinering presence alone was designed to remind me of my rank in this house. Beneath the furniture, beneath the silver, beneath the apples, I was peeling for people who had never once said thank you. My father shuffled out of the kitchen carrying a porcelain teapot. He poured my mother's chamomile tea first, then turned to serve her guests, his slippers scuffing against the hardwood in a rhythm so submissive it sounded like an apology. He did not make eye contact with me. He stepped deliberately around my chair as if I were a piece of broken equipment blocking a doorway, giving my corner a wide, conspicuous berth. His silence was not neutral. That careful side-up around my existence was active complicity, a physical declaration that he had chosen his side, and it was not mine. It cut deeper than any insult my cousin was about to deliver. My cousin sat across from me, sipping her chamomile tea from the cup my father had so obediently filled. She flashed her new diamond ring, tilting her wrist so the stone caught the overhead light, and her sharp eyes slid down to my calloused hands gripping the paring knife. She leaned forward, adjusting the collar of her designer blouse, and her voice came out in that weaponized, pitying whine she had perfected over the years. "Maria, your skin has gotten so dark lately," she cooed, letting the words hang in the air, like perfume sprayed over garbage. No time for skin air in the military. Look at me. I just signed a $500,000 PR contract this morning. Sometimes I wonder what kind of future does a woman have when she insists on throwing herself into the line of fire. My mother smirked from the dining table, her hand pausing mid-polish on a silver fork, silently validating every syllable. She did not need to add words. That smirk was the green light. My cousin had been waiting for the maternal approval that made cruelty feel like a family sport. I watched my cousin's jaw tighten as she spoke, a tiny, involuntary flinch at the corner of her mouth. I knew that flinch. It was the exact same nervous twitch she had 15 years ago, when I smashed a shed window with my bare fist to drag her out of the pitch dark, where she had been crying, paralyzed with fear, too weak to even call for help. Her arrogance, now the designer blouse, the $500,000 contract, the diamond ring waved in my face. All of it was a desperate lifelong bandage, plastered over the humiliating memory that I was the brave one. And she had always been a coward. She hated my uniform, because every brass button on it screamed that truth into a room she could never leave. My uncle uncrossed and recrossed his legs in the velvet armchair. clearing his throat to piggyback on his daughter's assault. He took the cup of tea from my father's hands without a word of thanks, stirring it with a silver teaspoon, like a man rehearsing for a role he had never earned. A real career is one that creates economic value. Maria, he lectured, his voice inflated with borrowed authority. You wasted your youth in a place that offers no real practical benefit. And now look, where do you stand compared to your own cousin? He gestured grandly with the tissue, as though he were a Fortune 500 CEO dispensing wisdom from a penthouse. I kept my eyes on the apple in my hand and let the blade bite into the white flesh. I knew the truth behind his performance. My uncle had gone bankrupt 3 times. 3 separate financial collapses, each one more pathetic than the last. 3 times he had crawled on his knees to my mother, and 3 times she had quietly written him a check, sliding it across the kitchen table at midnight when she thought nobody was watching. But I had watched. I had stood in the dark hallway at 14 years old and seen my mother hand him more money than my entire year's school supplies would cost. The same week, she told me the military did not pay real money and that I was wasting my life. His lecture on economic value was the most expensive joke in the room, funded entirely by the woman smirking behind him, and every person at that table benefited from the lie except me. My father stood right beside my uncle's chair. He heard every insulting word about my career, my choices, my wasted youth, my inferior position compared to my pampered cousin. Instead of opening his mouth, my father turned to my uncle and gave him a weak, submissive nod, a pathetic little bob of the head that said, "I agree. She is less than she does not matter." Then he scurried back into the kitchen to refill the teapot, his slippers whispering against the floor. That nod, that single cowardly gesture of agreement from the man who was supposed to protect me, it cut deeper than my uncle's entire existence combined. My hands shook. The same hands that had been trained to hold perfectly steady when lives depended on it now vibrated with the raw, volcanic urge to flip the heavy coffee table and shatter every porcelain cup in this suffocating room. I forced my muscles to obey. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds out. Tactical breathing, the one gift from my training that kept me from self-destructing in this house. I looked up from the plate. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I did not explain that my military allowances and investments had quietly built me a financial independence that dwarfed my cousin's flashy PR contracts. I offered my cousin and my uncle a perfectly programmed, dead smile, the kind of smile that had no warmth behind it, only the polished surface of a woman who had been performing obedience for a decade. I placed the final apple slice on the gold-rimmed plate with terrifying precision, then slid the paring knife down slowly, deliberately, until the tip of the blade pointed directly at my cousin's teacup. I stood up in complete silence and walked out of the room without a word. My absolute stillness left my cousin blinking rapidly, her smug expression cracking, suddenly unnerved by the physical control she could never possess. My uncle cleared his throat again, the teaspoon trembling in his cup, the bravado leaking out of him like air from a punctured tire. My footsteps crossed the threshold of our front door, and the next time they echoed against polished stone, I was standing inside the Sterling mansion for the engagement party. The Sterling estate was an impenetrable monument to what real money looked like when it stopped trying to impress anyone. Massive crystal chandeliers cast blinding cold light across authentic Persian rugs that cost more than my mother's entire wardrobe combined. I retreated immediately to the darkest corner by the heavy red velvet curtains. Taking a glass of ice water from a passing waiter, I positioned myself with my back flat against the wall, scanning the room the way I had been trained to scan every room I entered, identifying exits, reading body language, cataloging threats. This was my vantage point, my observation post. The curtain's thick fabric pressed against my shoulder blades, and I let the shadows swallow me whole. My cousin and my uncle flanked my mother in the center of the room. Acting like bodyguards, escorting a head of state, they held their champagne flutes too tightly, fingers white around the stems, their eyes darting around in desperate awe of the billionaires circulating around them. They were trying so hard to belong, but the overpowering stench of my mother's cheap, heavy perfume betrayed all 3 of them. clashing violently with the subtle, expensive floral arrangements of the Sterling estate. I turned my head slightly and breathed through my mouth. Even from across the room, the scent was a confession of everything my mother was trying to hide. My mother dripped in gaudy, oversized jewelry rings stacked on fingers that had never done a day of hard, layered necklaces layered 3 deep, as if quantity could substitute for taste. She spotted Victoria Sterling, the matriarch of the Sterling dynasty, and latched onto her with the desperation of a drowning woman grabbing a life preserver. "Oh, Lady Victoria, this party is absolutely beyond imagination." My mother gushed her fake smile, stretched so wide it looked like her face might crack apart. She reached back and violently yanked my brother forward by his lapel, nearly choking him, presenting him like a show dog at a competition. "This is my Wes, the pride of our family, the most outstanding financial expert at just 28. I watched my mother's manic, dilated eyes from across the room and recognized the animal terror behind the performance. I had seen that same desperate, hunted expression in old family photographs in the grainy snapshots from a childhood she had tried to burn out of existence. She was the terrified little girl who had been beaten by her alcoholic veteran father in a crumbling house that smelled of cheap whiskey and failure. A man whose nightmares kept the neighbors awake and whose shaking hands made the whole street whisper. She was running from that poverty, running so hard and so fast that she would sacrifice anything, including her own daughter's identity, to make absolutely sure the Starings never smelled that history on her skin. My brother looked panicked, suffocating in his tight tuxedo. He opened his mouth, his eyes cutting nervously toward my dark corner, and for one brief second, I saw guilt flicker across his face like a match struck in a windstorm. He was going to mention his older sister. My mother's sharp stiletto heel came down viciously on his foot, the crunch of designer leather against polished shoe, barely audible beneath the string quartet. But the micro-expression on his face said everything. He flinched. His jaw snapped shut. His head dropped in immediate submission. My cousin caught the exchange from 3 feet away and smirked behind her champagne glass, thoroughly enjoying watching the golden boy being physically controlled by the same iron fist that had been pounding me flat for a decade. My uncle stood behind them, nodding along like a dashboard ornament, reflexively validating whatever my mother did. I stood frozen behind the curtain. I watched my own brother, the boy I had raised, the boy I had bled for, allow my absolute eraser just to purchase a few minutes of peace from our mother. His silence was louder than any insult my cousin had ever thrown, but my mother severely underestimated Victoria Sterling. The billionaire matriarch was not fooled by the cheap perfume, the gaudy jewelry, or the graveling. Victoria's icy, intelligent eyes slid right off my mother's pathetic grin like water off polished marble. She looked past my brother, past a smirking cousin, past my nodding uncle, and her gaze pierced through the crowded room, landing squarely on me in the shadows. She saw my rigid, perfectly straight spine pressing against the wall. She recognized the silent stillness of someone accustomed to scanning for threats. Victoria's eyes flicked briefly to a large oil portrait hanging on the far wall, a Sterling ancestor in full military dress medals gleaming on his painted chest. The family's heritage of service immortalized in gold frame and oil paint. Then her eyes returned to me. Victoria's lips curled into a microscopic smirk of absolute contempt aimed entirely at my mother. Without a single word of acknowledgement to my mother's flattery, Victoria turned her back and walked away, leaving my mother standing there humiliated, clutching her empty champagne glass so hard I could see her knuckles whiten from across the room. My cousin's smirk faltered for the first time. My uncle looked down at his shoes. The grave had been dug, and my mother had just handed Victoria the shovel. That night, the house was dead silent. The air in my childhood bedroom felt thick and suffocating, as though the walls were slowly closing in on the mattress. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at 2 objects laid out before me. On the left, the repulsive blue silk dress my mother had forced upon me, spread across the comforter like a surrender flag, smooth and lifeless and perfectly pressed. On the right, resting on my nightstand, sat my military challenge coin, heavy, rusted, the ridged edges caked in a dark, unwashable brown crust. the dried remnants of Corporal Leo Griffin's final moments on this earth. I reached out and picked up the coin. The instant the cold metal touched my skin, the silence of my suburban bedroom shattered. The walls dissolved. The smell of the silk dress was obliterated by the stench of burning diesel dry dust, and the metallic taste of fear that coated the roof of my mouth. The room vanished, and I was back in the field. Leo was only 19. A kid who had never had a legal beer, never had his first kiss, never finished telling me the joke about the farmer, and the 3 chickens that he had started that morning over cold rations. Laughing so hard he choked on powdered coffee. He collapsed into my arms with his full weight, and my knees buckled beneath the sudden, terrible heaviness of a young man whose body had just decided to stop working. Warmth spread rapidly across my hands and soaked through my fatigues. Sticky and relentless, a spreading tide that no amount of pressure could stop. I pressed both my palms against his chest, screaming until my vocal cords tore for a medic who was too far away to hear me over the chaos surrounding us. His trembling fingers reached up, shaking violently, and forced the copper coin into my palm, curling my fingers closed around its sharp ridged edges until the metal bit deep into my skin. "Lieutenant, you have to live. You are our pride," he choked out. His eyes, wide and terrified, stared up into the empty sky above us, and then those eyes went still permanently. The light behind them simply switched off like a lamp unplugged from a wall. And the boy, who had been telling chicken jokes that morning, became the heaviest weight I would ever carry for the rest of my life. I gripped the coin so hard in my present-day bedroom that the sharp, rusted edge sliced into my callous flesh. A bead of fresh, warm crimson welled up on my knuckles, catching the dim lamplight and rolled down to the base of my thumb. A cold draft hit the back of my neck, pulling me violently out of the nightmare. I looked up. My Aunt Clara stood in the open doorway of my bedroom. She did not speak. She never needed to. Her tired, sad eyes moved slowly from my bleeding hand to the pathetic blue dress on the bed, and something hardened behind her expression. A fury so old and so compressed, it had become geological like rock formed under pressure over decades. I looked back at her and saw the ghost of my grandfather in her face. He had come back from his own service, broken and hollowed out a man who jumped at the sound of car doors slamming and could not sleep without the light on. My mother had relentlessly mocked his nightmares, ridiculed his shaking hands at the dinner table, belittled his pain in front of neighbors until he crawled into a bottle and drank himself to death in total isolation. Clara had watched her own father be destroyed by this woman. She was now watching the same woman try to destroy another generation of veterans using the same playbook, the same cruelty, the same vicious eraser of sacrifice. Clara stepped into the room. She ignored the blue dress entirely as if it did not exist. She reached out and briefly firmly touched the shoulder of my olive-drab duffel bag, the bag holding my military uniform, and her fingers lingered on the rough canvas for a moment, the same way I had once seen her touch the collar of her father's old military jacket. Before my mother burned it in the backyard fire pit, while Clara screamed at her to stop. Clara gave me one slow, deliberate nod. That nod carried the accumulated fury of 2 generations of sacrifice being spat upon by the same cruel, selfish woman. Clara turned and walked away down the dark hallway without a word. She did not need to speak. Her silent command was louder than anything my mother had ever screamed. My silence had made me an accomplice. Every day I wore that blue dress and peeled those apples and swallowed those insults I was trampling on Leo's grave. I looked at the fresh stain on my knuckles. I reached out and shoved the blue silk dress off the bed. It crumpled onto the floor like a dead, useless thing. I would not wear it. The fabric pulled on the cold hardwood, and by the time I sat down at the Sterling rehearsal dinner the following evening, I had crammed myself into a shapeless neutral beige outfit, the last civilian camouflage I would ever agree to put on. The rehearsal dinner at the Sterling estate was a masterclass in high society hypocrisy. Crystal wine glasses clinked over polished mahogany tables, while waiters in white gloves circulated with trays of imported champagne. I shrank myself into the far corner of our assigned table, folding my hands in my lap, reducing my physical presence to the smallest possible footprint. My mother was across the room aggressively laughing at a joke made by a sterling executive. Her head thrown back too far, her laugh too loud, desperate to secure her foothold in this world that would never accept her. My brother hurried over to my table. He looked over his shoulder like a fugitive, checking for police, then slid into the seat beside me. His hands rubbed together frantically, slick with nervous sweat, the friction of his palms creating a soft, desperate whisper that sounded like a prayer. He refused to meet my eyes. "Sis," he whispered, his voice trembling, "tomorrow. Please just act normal. Do not do anything to draw attention. I am begging you." The Sirens cared deeply about appearances. I stared into his terrified, darting eyes and saw the same frail little boy who used to hide behind my legs, crying hysterically when the neighborhood kids chased him home from school. I had broken my own knuckles on a playground wall, keeping him safe. I had intercepted fists and insults and cruelty that was meant for his soft, trembling body, and I had absorbed all of it, without complaint, because that is what older sisters do. I had shielded him with my own flesh for over 20 years, and here he sat, the man I had built with my sacrificed childhood, begging me to erase my existence because my lack of civilian polish might embarrass his wealthy bride's family. He was not asking me to be quiet, he was asking me to die, to become a ghost at his wedding. My father stood a few feet away, pretending to examine a floral arrangement so he would not have to witness another one of his children requesting my disappearance. I swallowed the bitter, jagged reality of my brother's betrayal, offered him no verbal reassurance, and simply gave him a slow, dead nod. My brother exhaled a massive breath of relief and skewered away his sweaty hands, finally separating his shoulders, dropping as though a massive weight had been lifted. The weight he had just dropped was me. My cousin and uncle swooped in to feed. They had watched my brother's groveling performance and smelled vulnerability, the way jackals smell injury. My cousin slid into the seat my brother had just vacated, smirking the predatory gleam of a scavenger detecting an open wound. "Oh my God, Maria. You are actually going to wear that dried-out hairstyle to the wedding. How pitiful. I guess they do not teach women how to look pretty in the military." She snickered, running her fingers through her own perfectly styled curls with exaggerated self-admiration, her diamond ring flashing under the chandelier. My uncle leaned over behind her, laughing loudly enough to ensure the neighboring tables heard him dominating the disgraceful veteran. "Come on now, cut her some slack. Not everyone has the talent to sit in an air-conditioned office like you." "Sweetheart," he announced, puffing his chest, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had borrowed his entire lifestyle from my mother's checkbook. They were building their towering house of cards on the assumption that military service was a shameful low-class endeavor. They had no idea they were sitting in a mansion owned by a family that worshipped the uniform. Every oil portrait on these walls depicted a sterling and service dress. Every glass they raised was paid for by contracts built on patriotic legacy. The irony was so thick I could taste it, metallic and bitter, like biting into a coin. I ignored them entirely, reaching out to pick up my water glass. But as my arm extended, I felt a heavy, piercing gaze lock onto me from across the room. 3 tables away, sitting at the VIP table, a broad-shouldered older man paused with his wine glass hovering halfway to his mouth. Retired Master Sergeant Marcus Vance was not looking at my face. He was staring at my spine, ramrod, straight despite the shapeless beige outfit, and at the way my fingers subconsciously pitched the seam of my trousers, an ingrained, unbreakable reflex beaten into muscle memory by years of discipline. His ancient predatory eyes flashed with immediate recognition. He set his wineglass down with deliberate precision, a controlled habitual motion, and subtly adjusted his own posture to mirror mine. His broad shoulders squaring his chin, lifting one veteran, acknowledging another through the language of the body. Amidst a flock of gossiping civilians, the old wolf had recognized a fellow predator hiding in beige camouflage. I quickly averted my gaze and pretended to adjust my napkin. The veteran knew I was here, and my mother's fake civilian masquerade had just sprung a massive leak. Before we reach the breaking point that changes this family forever, please hit the like button. Have you ever been pushed to your absolute limit by your own family? Let me know in the comments below. The sharp hiss of steam cut through the silence of the empty laundry room. The afternoon sun slashed through the blinds in thin horizontal bands, striping the ironing board and the wretched blue dress draped across it. The house was empty. Everyone was at the salon, getting their hair and nails done for the ceremony. I was alone, numbly pressing the hot iron across the silk, flattening out wrinkles as if I were preparing my own burial shroud. The hiss of the steam sent a shiver down my spine, because it was identical to the hiss of the mechanical ventilator in the field hospital 10 years ago, when a piece of shrapnel tore through my shoulder and I woke up on a cot staring at a fluorescent ceiling that smelled like antiseptic and despair. My father had sat by my bed that night. He was still wearing his rumpled bank manager suit, his employee badge still clipped to his breast pocket, his tie loosened, but not remove the uniform of a man who had rushed from his office to a military hospital, without stopping to change, without stopping to think, without stopping to be anything other than a terrified father. He held my good hand in both of his trembling palms. I promise from now on, Daddy will always protect you. He wept, his tears falling on the bleached hospital sheets, soaking into the fabric, creating small dark circles that spread like tiny maps of his grief. That memory echoed in my head, a haunting phantom of paternal love, right as my phone emitted a sharp, clinical beep from the counter. The tone matched the pitch of the hospital heart monitor perfectly. A text from Aunt Clara, an image file. I put the iron down and opened the screenshot. It was a family group chat titled Wedding Logistics. I was the only member of the Reed family excluded from this conversation. Everyone else was there. My mother, my father, my brother, my cousin, my uncle, everyone except the soldier. My mother's text burned across the glowing screen like acid. Listen carefully. Nobody mentions the military in front of the starings. That disgraceful occupation will ruin this family. Push Maria down to table number 9, out of sight behind the stone pillar. Do not let her wear that uniform. The enablers fell in line, instantly, desperate to please the matriarch. My cousin's response popped up beneath, punctuated by a clapping emoji. Absolutely, Auntie. Letting her show, her face would only dirty up our lineup. My uncle chimed in seconds later, his contribution as predictable as his bankruptcy filings. Exactly. Keep her out of sight. The cruelty from my mother and cousin did not break me. I had expected it. Their contempt was as reliable as gravity. But what shattered my soul into a million jagged pieces was the tiny gray text at the very bottom of the screen. 4 words that rewrote my entire life. Seen by Thomas Reed. My father read every single word of my mother's plan to erase my existence. He read the insults. He read the orders. He read the conspiracy to hide his own daughter behind a stone pillar, like a shameful secret at her own brother's wedding. And he chose silence. He did not type a response. He did not call me. He did not push back. He simply read the messages, absorbed the cruelty, and closed his phone. Staring at that timestamp, the last remaining illusion in my life dissolved like sugar in boiling water. His tears in the hospital a decade ago were never for me. They were the tears of a weak man, terrified of conflict. A man who showed up to my bedside still wearing his work badge, because even in a crisis, he could not step out of his role as an employee. He never intended to protect me. He sold my dignity that afternoon, just to purchase his own peace from my mother's screaming. The final frayed thread holding my civilian obedience together snapped. I did not cry. I did not scream. A terrifying sub-zero calmness washed over my brain, extinguishing all grief, all hope, all pain. My breathing slowed. My heartbeat dropped to a resting rate. The room sharpened into hyper-focused clarity. Every edge crisp, every shadow defined, every sound amplified. I reached out and unplugged the iron. I watched the blue dress slide off the ironing board and crumple onto the cold tile floor into a pathetic wrinkled heap. I stepped directly over it. The era of my invisibility was over. My mother wanted a ruthless confrontation over her social standing. I was finally going to give her one. The dress lay in a heap on the tile. By the time I dropped my olive drab duffel bag onto a velvet chair in the silent dressing room at the back of the Sterling estate, the next evening, that blue silk was already a relic of a dead woman's compliance. I chose tactical mercy for the morning church ceremony. I arrived late, dressed in unassuming civilian clothes, hiding myself in the dark shadows of the back pew, where the stained glass cast long-colored shadows across the wooden bench. Across the aisle, I saw my mother's shoulders drop in visible relief when she spotted me blending into the background like furniture. She thought she had won. She thought the group chat had worked. My cousin nudged my uncle, pointing at me in the back row and whispering something snide behind her program. My uncle chuckled. I ignored them all completely. I watched my brother slide the ring onto Sloane's finger and kiss her. As the priest pronounced them husband and wife, I let one single tear fall. It rolled down my cheek and hit the wooden pew in complete silence. It was a tear of genuine joy for the little brother I had raised, the boy I had carried on my back through the worst years of both our childhoods. But it was also a quiet funeral for the blind, foolish sisterly love I had wasted, protecting a man who refused to protect me. I wiped the tear with the back of my hand and straightened my spine. This was the last gift I would give him without a cost. As the 200 elite guests poured out of the church and transitioned to the Sterling mansion. For the grand evening reception, I broke away from the family convoy. I slipped through a side entrance, down a carpeted hallway lined with oil portraits of Sterling ancestors in military dress, and found my way to a small empty dressing room at the back of the estate. I locked the heavy wooden door behind me. The click of the lock echoed in the silent room. I dropped my duffel bag onto a velvet chair and unzipped it with both hands. Inside there was no silk, no lace, no pathetic civilian camouflage. I reached in and pulled out the United States Marine Corps dress blues, the ultimate symbol of discipline, sacrifice, and honor. My mother thought this uniform was a disgrace that would get her thrown out of high society. She had no idea it was the master key to the Sterling family's deepest respect. I stood before the full-length gold leaf mirror. I slid my arms into the midnight blue jacket with the striking blood-red piping. I secured the first brass button with a sharp metallic click that echoed in the quiet room, and the sound triggered my cousin's voice. Economic value, click. My uncle's pompous lecture about wasted youth, click. My brother's trembling plea for me to be invisible, click. My mother's "hide that uniform," click. My father's cowardly nod. Each brass fastening sealed another wound shut with armor. Each metallic snap and answer to an insult that would never land again. The creases in my trousers were sharp enough to cut glass. With absolute reverence and a steady hand, I pinned the silver star to my left breast. The metal's weight settled against my chest, like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Beneath it, tucked safely in my inner breast pocket, rested Leo Griffin's challenge coin, its heavy weight pressed directly against my heart. A 19-year-old kid riding into this final confrontation with me, his last words pulsing through the rusted metal and into my ribcage. I was no longer the obedient daughter. I was Captain Reed. I was fully armed, a soft creak behind me, a flash of white movement in the mirror. I turned my head slightly. Sloane, the bride, was standing in the hallway looking through the cracked door. She must have come back to touch up her makeup. My mother had sworn the Starings would be disgusted by my military presence. She had built her entire strategy on that assumption, gambled her entire social future on it. Sloane did not look horrified. She stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes widened, taking in the dress blues, the gleaming brass, the blood-red piping, and the silver star, and a profound, beautiful smile of absolute respect crossed her face. She did not speak. She placed her right hand over her heart, gave me a deep, solemn nod of acknowledgement, and turned away to head to the reception, her white gown swishing softly against the marble floor. The venom in my mother's lies was permanently neutralized. The stage was set. It was time to step into the light. Sloane's white gown disappeared around the corner, and the sun bled red across the manicured Sterling lawns. Orchestral music swelled from the grand ballroom ahead, where hundreds of elite guests mingled beneath a ceiling painted with Renaissance clouds and gilded angels. I marched down the hallway, the brass buttons of my dress blues gleaming under the antique sconce lights, my boots striking the marble with measured, deliberate rhythm. I stood before the massive oak doors leading into the reception, inhaling the cool evening air, centering my heart rate. My hand reached for the heavy brass handle. The frantic, panicked clattering of high heels erupted against the marble behind me. Sharp and desperate, the sound of a woman running in shoes designed for standing still. Two sterling security guards standing near the coat turned their heads, their hands resting on their earpieces, watching the approaching commotion with trained alertness. My mother lunged out of a side corridor, her heavily contoured face twisted into a psychotic mask of sheer terror at the sight of my dress blues. She did not see the guards watching her. "Have you lost your mind, Maria?" she shrieked, her voice cracking like glass against concrete, shattering the elegance of the hallway. She raised her jewel-encrusted hands, clawing wildly at the air, wanting to physically rip the uniform off my body, but too terrified to touch the military fabric. "You are going to destroy this family. Get out through the back gate right now. You are the disgrace of this entire family." Her desperation was completely feral. I looked into her wild, bloodshot eyes and saw the exact same unhinged panic she had displayed 20 years ago when she burned my grandfather's military jacket in the backyard, because the neighbors had started asking about his service record. She had poured lighter fluid on the olive drab fabric, while Aunt Clara screamed at her to stop, while the smoke rose thick and black and carried the ghost of a broken veteran's dignity into the sky. She was terrified, not of the starings but of herself. Terrified that my uniform would rip open the carefully sealed vault of her low-class traumatic roots and expose them to every billionaire inside that room. My father scurried up behind her like a frightened rat out of breath, his forehead slick with sweat. He reached out a trembling hand, not to stop his wife from screaming at his daughter in a public hallway, but to push me away from the doors. "Maria, sweetheart, do not make your mother angry." He stammered, his eyes darting frantically to the floor. Utterly terrified of looking at the silver star pinned to my chest, as though the metal itself might judge him. "We are fine. Please just go back to the car." Those words, "we are fine, we are fine." It was the exact same phrase he had used years ago when he told me to stop defending my brother from our uncle's bullying, the same spineless mantra he had chanted every time silence was easier than courage. My father's definition of peace had never changed. It was and always had been absolute submission to abuse. The sterling guards exchanged a look of profound disgust at my father's cowardice, their jaws tightening their professionalism, barely masking their contempt for a man who would beg his own decorated daughter to crawl out the back door. Whatever lingering pity I had for my father vaporized in that hallway. I swatted his weak, trembling hand away with the blinding speed of a decorated veteran. He gasped, stumbling back into the wall, his shoulder hitting the marble with a dull thud. I stepped directly into my mother's personal space, forcing her to shrink backward, her spine pressing against the cold corridor wall, her gaudy necklaces jangling as she retreated. I looked down into the dark, empty abyss of her eyes, and I delivered my final command in a voice that could cut steel. "I am not destroying this family. You already smashed it to pieces with your lies. And hear me clearly, Evelyn. I am not the disgrace of this family." I did not wait for her to process her defeat. I placed both palms flat against the heavy oak doors and shoved them open, stepping straight into the blinding light of the ballroom. The instant my boots crossed the threshold, the ballroom froze. The string quartet sputtered and died mid-note, as if an invisible hand had grabbed the bows and held them still. Hundreds of hushed elite conversations were instantly strangled into total silence. Over 200 of the wealthiest people in the country turned their heads as one. A synchronized rotation of diamond earrings, platinum cufflinks, and silk lapels, all swiving toward the source of the disturbance. Standing amidst a sea of fragile tuxedos and designer gowns, my midnight blue and blood-red uniform radiated raw, undeniable authority. The dress blues did not ask for permission to exist. They commanded the room simply by being present the way a mountain commands a valley. At table 2, I saw my cousin freeze with a champagne flute halfway to her lips, her wrist suspended in midair, her mascara, heavy eyes widening in confusion. She leaned over to my uncle, a malicious smirk forming her lips, already shaping the word disgrace, waiting for sterling security to march over and throw me out. My uncle adjusted his tie and crossed his arms, preparing to enjoy the spectacle of his niece's public humiliation. Behind me, hovering in the doorway like ghosts, my parents stood paralyzed. My mother's face was drained of all color, her skin the grayish white of old newspaper. She held her breath, her entire body clenched into a rigid column of pure dread, waiting for the Sterling family to destroy me socially and validate every lie she had ever told about my uniform. She was entirely unaware of the devastation she had walked into. The reckoning did not come from where any of them expected. At the VIP head table, the suffocating silence was violently shattered by the screech of heavy wood dragging across marble. The sound was so sharp, so aggressive, that the crystal glasses on the nearest tables physically vibrated, and a woman at table 3 flinched and grabbed her husband's arm. Retired Master Sergeant Marcus Vance kicked his chair back and shot to his feet with the explosive speed of a man who had spent 40 years answering to duty. He did not look at my face. His massive chest puffed out, his eagle eyes locked squarely on the left side of my chest, reading the silver star the way a believer reads sacred text. His body snapped to rigid attention, his fists pressed against the seams of his trousers, his jaw set like granite. With a voice that boomed across the ballroom, rattling the chandelier crystals above, and reverberating off the marble walls like rolling thunder, he roared a single command: "Silver star in the hall." Hearing that authoritative roar instantly transported me back to the parade deck. It was the sound of absolute respect, a brotherhood that my civilian family could never comprehend, would never deserve to comprehend, and had spent a decade trying to bury beneath cheap silk dresses and gold-rimmed apple plates. That single command ripped through the room. In an instant, a synchronized cacophony of scraping chairs echoed through the hall. 12 heavy wooden seats dragging across marble in rapid succession, the sound building into a crescendo that shook the floor beneath the Persian rugs. 12 men titans of industry billionaires, political heavyweights, men whose signatures moved stock markets, and whose phone calls reshaped industries, snapped to their feet simultaneously. Every single one of them had served. They stood at perfect attention, their spines rigid, their chins high, and snapped their right hands to their brows, delivering a flawless, dead, silent military salute directly to me. 12 salutes. 12 men who understood exactly what the Silver Star meant, exactly what price had been paid for it, exactly what kind of person earned one, and lived to wear it. The room held its collective breath. 200 civilians stood frozen in absolute awe, watching 12 of the most powerful men in America honor a woman their hostess had hidden at table number 9, behind a stone pillar. Richard Sterling, the billionaire patriarch and father of the bride, broke from the formation. He marched straight toward me across the ballroom floor, his polished shoes clicking against the marble with purpose and authority, ignoring my hyperventilating mother in the doorway, as though she were a shadow that had no substance. He reached me and took my rough, calloused hands in both of his grip warm and firm and trembling with genuine emotion, the kind of emotion that money cannot manufacture and social climbing can never purchase. His eyes were wet. His voice was thick, steady, reverent. "Captain Reed, the Sterling dynasty was built on the blood and bones of patriots. Your presence is the greatest honor this wedding could receive." The shockwave hit my family like a physical wall of sound. My cousin's champagne flute slipped from her trembling fingers and shattered on the marble floor, the delicate crystal exploding into 100 glittering fragments at her feet, her smug face melting into sheer unadulterated panic as she realized that the wealthy idol she worshipped, the billionaires she had spent her entire career trying to impress with $500,000 PR contracts, were now bowing to the woman she had called a disgrace. Her diamond ring meant nothing in this room. My uncle turned a sickening shade of gray, shrinking down in his seat, his chin dropping to his chest, his lectures about economic value dissolving into dust. And then Lady Victoria Sterling glided forward. She moved through the crowd with the terrifying grace of a woman who had spent 60 years separating the real from the fake with a single glance, and who had never once been wrong. She did not even look at me. Her predator's gaze locked onto my mother, who was now shivering uncontrollably in the doorway, mascara streaking down her contoured cheeks, her gaudy jewelry suddenly looking like costume pieces from a discount store. Victoria stopped 3 feet from my mother. The entire room leaned in. The silence was absolute. Victoria's voice was soft, but it sliced through the dead air like a surgical scalpel. You intended to hide a hero at table number 9, Mrs. Reed. The truth crushed my mother instantly. Her fake empire built on a decade of lies eraser and the systematic destruction of her own daughter's identity burned to ash in a matter of seconds before the entire elite society she had worshipped from afar. Every person in that room now understood. The graveling socialite who had paraded her son like a trophy and hidden her decorated daughter behind a stone pillar was exposed for exactly what she was. A fraud, a coward, a woman who had tried to bury a hero to protect a lie about herself. I stood tall in the center of the ballroom, my spine straighter than it had ever been. Leo's coin pressing against my heart beneath the silver star. I fought back tears of absolute vindication. The kind of tears that only come when the world finally, brutally, undeniably confirms that you were right and they were wrong. I raised my hand and returned the salute to my 12 brothers in arms. Marcus Vance gave me a single fierce nod from across the room, his old wolf eyes glistening, his massive jaw clenched with pride. I had been seen not by my family, by my people. As the reception slowly shifted toward the dining area, the elite guests giving us a wide, intensely judgmental berth, the foyer became a reckoning ground. My mother realized she had drastically miscalculated. She was about to be permanently exiled from the high society she had sacrificed her daughter to infiltrate. A nauseating pivot began. She lunged forward, grabbing my arm, forcing a frantic, psychotic smile for the watching Sterling family members still lingering in the doorway. Oh, I have always been so proud of my daughter. My Maria is absolutely wonderful. She babbled, her voice, shaking her grip on my sleeve tight. And desperate, her painted nails digging into the midnight blue fabric she had called a disgrace less than an hour ago. She was trying to harvest the fruit from a tree she had spent a decade chopping down. And the desperation in her eyes was the most pathetic thing I had ever witnessed. I looked down at her clawed hand on my sleeve. With absolute disgust, I shoved her arm away. My voice rang out loud enough for Victoria Sterling to hear from the hallway, loud enough for every lingering guest to absorb and remember. Do not touch me. You tried to win their approval by hiding me at table number 9. You called this uniform a disgrace. Do not try to pick the sweet fruit from the tree you spent your whole life chopping down. She recoiled as if my words had physically struck her across the face. Her mouth opened and closed silently. A fish pulled from water, her carefully constructed vocabulary of manipulation, suddenly useless against a daughter who had stopped performing. My brother crashed into me from the side. He wrapped his arms around me and sobbed uncontrollably into my shoulder, his entire body shaking, his tears soaking through the shoulder of my dress blues. Sis, I am sorry. I am a coward. I never once had the guts to stand up and protect you. He wailed, his voice cracking and breaking the sound of a grown man who had finally looked in the mirror and seen the coward staring back. He clung to me the way he used to cling during thunderstorms, his fists balled in the fabric of my jacket, his face buried against my silver star. I stroked his hair once, just once. I accepted his tears because I remembered the little boy, not the man who had begged me to disappear. Sloane watched us from a few feet away, her gentle eyes wet with compassion, her hand resting instinctively on her husband's back, silently absorbing the full catastrophic truth of the family she had married into. Then my father shuffled forward. His hands shook so violently that the envelope he pulled from his jacket rustled like dry leaves in a storm. It was crumpled, yellowed, the corners soft from years of being hidden in the back of a desk drawer, behind bank statements and mortgage documents, and all the other paper walls of his small, cowardly life. It was the official combination letter for my silver star, mailed by the United States government 3 years ago. He had intercepted it the day it arrived. He had pulled it from the mailbox before my mother could see the government seal on the envelope, and he had hidden it from my mother, burying the official proof of my valor beneath mortgage statements and old bank receipts because he was terrified that she would see it, and her jealousy would turn his home into a screaming nightmare of resentment. He chose his own comfort over demanding respect for his daughter's greatest achievement. 3 years my father had kept my honor a secret in this house to buy 3 years of his own pathetic, spineless silence. The man who had promised to protect me in a hospital bed had been hiding the proof of my valor in a desk drawer. And I could picture him perfectly sitting at that desk late at night, sliding the envelope deeper behind the files every time his conscience tried to surface. "I am sorry, Maria. I am a useless man," he whimpered, his head bowed in absolute shame, his chin nearly touching his chest, his banker's tie hanging limp and crooked. Aunt Clara stepped out from the crowd behind him, her arms crossed, her jaw set like granite, her tired eyes finally witnessing the man who had enabled her own brother's destruction pay for a lifetime of cowardice. I took the concealed letter from his trembling hands. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out Leo Griffin's rusted-stained challenge coin, holding it high in the air where the chandelier light caught the dark crust on its reed surface. I scanned the room. My cousin and my uncle were cowering behind a marble pillar near the coat check, their faces ashen, their eyes locked on the floor, terrified of making eye contact with anyone who had just witnessed the 12 salutes. Their house of cards had collapsed, and they were standing in the rubble. "The honor today does not belong to me," I declared, my voice echoing off the marble walls, cutting through my parents' pathetic weeping like a blade through paper. "It belongs to the 19-year-old boys who laid down their lives so that all of you could have the privilege of sitting here and passing judgment." My words hit my uncle like a physical blow. He flinched visibly behind the pillar, his broad shoulders collapsing inward, his pompous lectures about economic value dissolving into the meaningless noise they had always been. My cousin pressed her palm against her mouth, her eyes wide and wet, her diamond ring suddenly looking obscene on a hand that had never once done anything worth honoring. I lowered the coin. I looked dead into my parents' eyes. First my mother's hollow and destroyed, then my father's pathetic and shrunken, holding each gaze long enough to burn my final judgment into their memory. "I forgive Wes. But for you, Mother, and you, Father, from this day forward, the line has been drawn." I did not wait for their apologies. I did not watch my mother's knees buckle, or my father's hands reach for a wall to keep himself upright. I did not look back at my cousin's shattered glass, or my uncle's gray, deflated face. I turned on my heel. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my boots echoed against the marble floor like a steady drumbeat. Each footfall a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence I had been writing for a decade. I walked away from the rot. I walked away from the lies, the cheap perfume, the gaudy jewelry, the silent nods, the stolen letters, the blue silk dress, the gold-rimmed plates of peeled apples, and every single suffocating year of manufactured invisibility. Behind me, I could hear my mother's heels stumble against the marble as her legs gave out, and the soft rustling of my uncle pulling my cousin toward the exit, retreating from a room that had just witnessed their entire fraudulent existence crumble. I did not turn around. There was nothing behind me worth seeing anymore. I walked toward the ballroom, toward the 12 men who had just saluted me, toward Marcus Vance's fierce, unwavering nod, toward Sloane's hand, resting gently on my brother's shaking back, toward a world where honor was recognized and sacrifice was sacred, and a 19-year-old kid's last words actually meant something. My spine was straighter than it had ever been. Leo's coin pressed against my heart, warm now, finally warm after all those years of carrying cold metal against cold silence, and I could swear I felt the faintest pressure of young fingers curling around mine one last time, letting me know he was proud. If you know the immense power of walking away from toxic people and finally taking your life back, please hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel to hear more stories of survival and strength, and share your own journey of boundary setting in the comments.